Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about socialism and particularly scientific socialism. We'll be getting more into that in the next video on Intro to Marxism. But as a general introduction to socialism, I think three areas to cover are necessary. One, terminology. Two, Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific is just a really nice piece, particularly the conclusion to it, where he wraps up the history of or a sketch of historical evolution, and then lastly looking at what exactly is the problem, and which shows you the solution with scientific socialism. Now, terminology. Let's just start with three basic terms: progressivism, communism, socialism. Progressivism, which is what I would call the major ideological development in the late 1800s by particularly German socialists of the chair, who brought back German ideology to the U.S. and started teaching in particular hotbed institutions like University of Wisconsin-Madison, Johns Hopkins University, and maybe even Columbia University. But not that they're that way today, but this is what was happening back in the 1880s or so, really the late 1800s and then on into the early 1900s. But just general progressivism, this ideology, the ideology of John Dewey, the ideology of hold on, wait for it. The ideology of Richard T. Ely. He's really the better guy as opposed to John Dewey. John Dewey's the later poster child for the movement, but Richard T. Ely is really where it's at when it comes to progressive ideology. But progressive ideology, just merely defined as such, the way I define them in my government and economics courses, are progressivism, an ideology based on an idea that historical and social progress are inevitable. The idea of progress assumes movement towards some ideal or end that usually includes the perfectibility of human nature and human society. So that's progressivism. Second term, communism. The term originates among revolutionary societies in the Paris of the 1830s, where it combined two meanings. First, the first meaning designated a political movement of or on behalf of the working class that was dedicated to the overthrow of emerging capitalist societies. And this also meant that this first part is an extreme and violent form of socialism. So communism would be an extreme and violent form of socialism. And then the second sense for communism is referring to the kind of society that such a movement wished to inaugurate, the ideology of Marx and Lenin. It is then the way I sum up communism is it's atheistic, anti-capitalistic, and it's expansionistic or international that way. It's easy three ways to approach it, and you get really most of the ideology in all three of those. Finally, socialism. The society replaces the individual ethically, morally, legally. That's my go-to definition of socialism. The society replaces the individual ethically, morally, and legally. So when you take that basic definition and compare it to founding ideology, so the ideology of the American or early American founding, it's really the exact, almost the inverse, right? Where the individuals are the primary the primary entity, whereas for socialism, the society, the social, is the primary entity. Additionally, the term applied to an economic system where property is held in common and not individually, and where relationship among people are governed by the politically organized compulsion that this common property status entails. This system is thus opposed to the market economy, where relationships among people are organized on the basis of individual liberty and private property. So you have those terms in front of you and their definitions, but I just wanted to reference those three as a beginning point for what is socialism. So it's important. It's not necessarily communism. Really, the best way to think about it is socialism is the mother of communism. Now moving on to Frederick Engels and his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. So in other words, he's arguing in the history of socialism, there's primarily two strands or brands that are developing. One is utopian socialism, the other one is scientific socialism. And scientific socialism is the true form, really, and particularly what leads to and embodies communism and the idea, really Marxism, Leninism. So the nice part, though, this document is still only about 30 pages long or so. It's written later as a nice clarification to the Communist Manifesto. And it's honestly a better history than the Communist Manifesto, but they both have their merits, pros and cons to both. But particularly for Engels, he's writing after Marx's death and later on, quite a few years after the manifesto is published. And just FYI, Engels and Marx are both they're comrades, they're BFFs. And really, Engels is more of the businessman, and Marx is the intellectual. But Engels can hold his own as well, and does hold his own, and particularly through this piece. But I want to point you to it has three parts in this piece. Utopian Socialism, Part 1, Part 2, Dialectics, and then Part 3, Historical Materialism. And at the end of Historical Materialism, which, by the way, you can access any of Marx and Engels' works online at Marxist.org, which is where really I get most of my documents from them. It's quite nice. It's all available, free, footnoted. It's all authoritative material. But at the end, or if you scroll down on Part 3 to the bottom of the page, it says, "Let us briefly sum up our sketch of historical evolution." And this is where you just get the real quick three-part outline of medieval society and how that then gave rise to capitalist revolution, and then finally on to the proletarian revolution. And those three parts, if you read those three parts in your reader or online, those three parts give you the full history and development of the problem, which is the third part here, the problem. If you look on your review sheet, Unit 3 Oral Exam Review Guide, and under number 30 is basically an outline of this last summary in Engels, okay? And so what it's doing is petty industry is representing medieval society, capitalism is capitalism or capitalist revolution, and socialism is representing the proletarian revolution here. And there's three questions that you ask of each. Who owns, who uses, and who appropriates? So basically, who owns the means of production, who uses the means of production, so who works in the factories as opposed to who owns the factories, and then who appropriates the results or the products or the produce from the factories and all the profit. Under petty industry, the individual did all those three. They owned, used, and appropriated. Under capitalism, the bourgeoisie owned it. They did not use it. And there is the problem. Because the proletariat, the laborers, the workmen, they use the machinery, use the property that's owned by the bourgeoisie, and guess who appropriates? The bourgeoisie. So we're not questioning the truth of this right now. We're just examining the ideology, particularly of scientific socialism, and this is the problem. The problem is right in that middle there, where the proletariat does not appropriate, does not own, and the bourgeois does not work, does not use. That's the problem. And so the solution is socialism. And the solution then is the next column, where under socialism, the proletariat, the laborers, the working class own, use, and appropriate the means of production. Okay, so all the factories, everything is essentially nationalized. Once you get into understanding what does this look like for socialism and socialism in society, it essentially means that it's becoming centrally owned and operated by, quote, the people. We'll see if that ever works out. But that's the problem, and that's the solution. So terminology, Engels, socialism, utopian and scientific, and then finally the problem, and just looking at that chart. That's it for today, folks. See ya.